Fake cops came to steal but what they didn't know was that I'm a U.S. Marshal. The story didn't begin that way. It started with something quieter. The creak of the iron gate when I first pulled into estates. Late afternoon sun, orange light bouncing off rows of polished mailboxes, kids zigzagging on bikes, their laughter trailing through the air. A neighbor waved, but not with warmth, more like checking me out, weighing me. I told myself it was just curiosity, but the truth, I was already under a microscope. The hummed as I cut the engine in the driveway. Its silver frame looked almost out of place against the sea of beige minivans. Dust clung to my boots as I stepped out, and for a moment I believed I'd found the quiet I wanted after years of chaos. A home where I could sleep without one eye open, without briefing papers stacked on the kitchen table. But calm has a way of hiding its cracks. I would see them soon enough. Sandra was the first crack. She came down the sidewalk with a clipboard, the kind of hurried steps that tell you she's always in other people's business. Her smile, God, it was sharp enough to cut glass. "Welcome to," she said like she was auditioning for Hostess of the Year, but her eyes lingered too long on the narrowing just enough to betray something else. Envy maybe, or control. "We have standards here," she added, tone dipping just slightly on the word standards. I'd heard her type before, the kind who confuses authority with ownership, the kind who thinks neighbors are soldiers under her command. I brushed it off. "Appreciate the welcome," I told her, even though it didn't feel like one. I carried a box inside, the smell of fresh paint and cardboard filling the hallway. A new start, I thought. But that night, lying in bed, I replayed her words in my head. "We have standards here." The first notice came 3 days later, a flimsy slip of paper folded into my mailbox. "Violation, improper parking a vehicle." I laughed when I read it. I hadn't left the driveway, my own property. The second notice followed, grass length exceeding HOA code. I'd cut it 2 days earlier, the mower tracks still visible. Then another, trash bins visible for extended period. I'd pulled them in less than an hour after pickup. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. I decided to face it head-on. The next HOA meeting was held in the community hall, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air stale like old coffee. Sandra sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 board members who didn't meet my eyes. I dropped the stack of notices on the table. The sound echoed louder than I meant, like a gavel. "Sandra," I said, calm but firm, "I've followed every rule. These fines are bogus. What game are you playing?" She leaned back, pen tapping against her teeth, the corner of her mouth curling into that plastic smirk. "Rules are rules," she replied. "If you can't handle them, maybe this community isn't a good fit for you." There it was, a threat dressed up as neighborly advice. A line meant to push me out. I held her stare. The room went still. Some neighbors shuffled in their chairs, eyes down, too afraid to take a side. I left that night with the heavy taste of warning in my mouth. This wasn't going to end with a few petty fines. A week later, I stepped out one morning, coffee steaming in my hand, only to freeze mid-sip. My tires, every single one, slashed. The cuts were jagged, cruel. A note was tucked beneath the windshield wiper. "Next time we take it." The cup slipped from my hand, coffee splattering across the driveway. My blood ran cold, then hot. This wasn't about grass or bins. This was criminal, personal. I crouched, fingertips brushing the torn rubber, the acrid smell of vandalism rising. My training kicked in. Photos, close-ups of the cuts, the note in frame, timestamps logged. I checked the doorbell cam, saved the footage. The sheriff's deputy came within the hour. Morale's steady eyes, leather boots dusted from the county roads. He studied the evidence, nodded slowly. "These people aren't amateurs if they're escalating," he warned. "Keep your cameras running." I intended to. That night, silence pressed heavy on the house. Every creak of the floorboard sounded louder than it should. I paced past the window, watching the glow of the outside. Somewhere beyond that glow, I imagined Sandra smiling, satisfied, but she had no idea who she was pushing. I'd faced cartels, fugitives, men with nothing to lose. And yet, in that quiet neighborhood with its trimmed hedges and cookie-cutter houses, I felt the same old tension coil inside me. Not fear, never fear, but the awareness that the fight had only just begun. Sometimes battles don't announce themselves. They creep in through notes on your windshield, through fake smiles and whispered threats. And sometimes the enemy wears pearls instead of a mask. But one thing I knew for certain, I don't scare easy, and I don't back down. They thought slashing my tires would shut me up, but all it did was tell me one thing: this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. The note burned in my hand. Next time we take it, not try, not warn, take. That word rang louder than the crows perched on the telephone wires above my driveway. It was a promise. I filed the report with Deputy Morales, but as I laid the photos on the counter at the station, I already knew how Sandra would play it. She'd deny. She'd smirk that perfect suburban smirk. She'd sit behind the shield of bylaws and her little empire of board members. It was all theater to her, but I'd seen this play before. Back at the next HOA meeting, I walked in carrying a folder thick with printouts, timestamps from my cameras, photos of the tires, the note tucked just so under the wiper. The scrape of the chair legs echoed when I pulled my seat across from her. Sandra was already waiting, pearls at her neck, pen twirling between her fingers like a gavel. I slid the folder across. Here's the report, photos, evidence. This isn't about trash cans or grass anymore. This is criminal. Her smile never moved, but her eyes gave her away. They flickered for just a second, the way someone blinks when a flashlight cuts the dark. Then she leaned in, speaking soft enough for the board to hear, but with an edge only I would catch. "Someone slashed your tires? That's awful," she said. "But you're making enemies by calling out neighbors. Careful, or you'll end up with more than a note." The room went still. Nobody met my eyes. One older man at the far end shifted, hands fidgeting with his cap, and gave me the smallest nod. He knew, they all knew, but fear is a language, and Sandra was fluent. I left the meeting that night with my jaw tight, the sound of her words circling in my head. Careful, not advice, a threat. The next few days I doubled down. Motion sensors, new angles on the cameras, everything back to the cloud. I set up alerts so the smallest rustle would ping my phone. This wasn't paranoia. This was insurance. The neighborhood carried on as if nothing was wrong. Sprinklers ticked in the mornings, kids rode scooters under the sun. But I noticed the little things. Curtains shifting when I pulled into the driveway. Conversations dropping to whispers when I passed by. Even the mailman seemed nervous, glancing at the like it was radioactive. And then, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, the mask slipped. It was 2:14 p.m. I remember because the notification chimed on my phone. Motion detected. I thumbed the screen and froze. The front cam lit up in high definition. A white SUV idled in my driveway. 3 men climbed out, reflective vests catching the sun. Bold letters stenciled on the back, HOA security. One carried a tow hook, another a heavy toolbox. They didn't knock. They didn't hesitate. They went straight to the... My heart thudded once, slow and heavy. This wasn't vandalism. This was theft, organized, timed, daylight boldness. I stepped out onto the porch. The old wood groaned beneath my boots, every sound in the heavy afternoon air. My right hand curled behind my back, fingers resting on the familiar grip of steel. I wasn't brandishing, not yet, but I was ready. "Hey," I called, voice cutting across the street. 2 of the men snapped their heads up. The third kept working, sliding the clamp toward the wheel. The lead man smirked, lifting a laminated badge clipped to his vest. "Official HOA enforcement," he barked. "You're in violation, vehicles being impounded." I stopped 3 paces away. The sun caught the edge of his badge. It was cheap, the lamination curling at the corner. A child's prop. "On what authority?" I asked, voice steady, boots grinding gravel as I closed the distance. They expected me to fold, to stutter, to back off like every other neighbor who'd been bullied by their game. Instead, I reached into my jacket, slow, deliberate. I didn't pull a weapon. Not yet. I let the light catch the silver star clipped at my waist. The United States Marshal's badge. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. The smirks drained from their faces. The lead man's mouth twitched, his confidence stuttering just enough to reveal the crack. "I'll ask once," I said, voice low, even. "Drop the tools, walk away." The man with the tow hook laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You're not a cop. This is HOA business." "Try me," I replied, eyes locked, every word sharpened by years of training. Behind them, my camera rolled on, wide angle, crystal clear. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds. The hum of cicadas filled the silence between words. The air itself felt electric, humming with the tension of a wire stretched too tight. One man tightened his grip on the crowbar, testing my resolve. Another shifted like a dog straining on a leash. They weren't walking away, not yet. The laugh came again, hollow this time, and I knew this wouldn't end with words. I could feel it in the rhythm of their bodies, the way their shoulders squared, the twitch in their hands. I'd been here before in alleys and doorways, facing men who thought intimidation was a weapon. They always forgot one thing. Training cuts cleaner than fear. The lead man stepped forward, crowbar raised, sun glinting off its edge. The sound of my boots on the porch seemed to echo louder as I moved to meet him. And that was the moment. The line between harassment and crime snapped. The crowbar glinted once in the sunlight, and then it swung for my ribs. A heavy, committed strike, not the warning kind, the kind meant to break bones. Time slowed the way it always does in moments like that. The world narrowed to the hiss of breath in my lungs, the crack of leather under my boots, the arc of steel heading straight for me. I didn't hesitate, couldn't. My body moved the way it had been trained 1,000 times in dim-lit gyms and dusty ranges. Step in, not back. Deflect, not retreat. I caught the momentum on my forearm, rolled it aside, and pivoted hard. My other hand came up fast and precise, weapon drawn but angled low. One squeeze, controlled, not wild, not reckless. The round hit meat, not bone, burying into the thick of his thigh. He dropped with a howl, crowbar clattering onto the gravel. Blood darkened the denim at his leg, spreading fast. Not fatal, but it ended his fight. The other two froze for a heartbeat, just one. Then bravado snapped back like a rubber band. One lunged with the tow hook, swinging clumsy in panic. The other grabbed for the pistol at my side. I pivoted into the first, wrist locking his arm, twisting until I felt the bone strain. He screamed when it snapped. A sharp, awful crack that made my neighbors gasp from behind their curtains. The third came from the blind's side, full body weight driving into me. My shoulder slammed against the hood of the hot metal burning through my shirt. Pain lit up my ribs, but instinct overrode it. I hooked his arm, turned, and drove him face first into the pavement. The thud echoed down the street. He twitched once, then went limp, groaning. It was over in seconds. Seconds that felt stretched into minutes. The kind of minutes that etched themselves into memory forever. My driveway cam caught all of it. Wide angle, crisp audio, timestamp ticking in the corner. Every shout, every fake badge, every desperate swing. The whole neighborhood would see it replayed before the day was over. I stood there in the center of it, breathing hard, pistol still steady, 3 men broken at my feet. My heart wasn't racing the way most would expect. My hands didn't shake. This wasn't adrenaline. This was discipline, years of it. The first man writhed on the ground, clutching his leg, blood seeping between his fingers. The second cradled his snapped wrist, tears streaming down his face as shock set in. The third groaned, rolling weakly on the pavement, his cheek already swelling purple where it had kissed concrete. Voices rose around me. Neighbors pouring out now, phones raised high, recording, gasps. A mother yanking her child back from the sidewalk. Someone whispering, "Oh my God, he shot him." I holstered the weapon with deliberate calm, badge still visible at my belt. "Stay back," I told the gathering crowd, voice firm but steady. "Scene's not secure." The wounded man screamed louder, pain splitting through the street. His blood pooled dark and wet, trickling toward the gutter. I crouched, checked the placement. Fleshy part of the thigh, high enough to stop movement but angled clear of the femoral. He wasn't dying. He was learning. Then came the wail of sirens. Faint at first, then growing, rising above the noise of whispers and crying kids. Red and blue lights sliced through the afternoon sun, cutting across the beige walls of like warning flares. Deputy Morale's cruiser was first in, tires crunching gravel. 2 more units behind, deputies stepping out with practiced precision. Rifles low, eyes scanning. "Hands where we can see," Morales shouted. My palms rose instantly, fingers spread. Calm, controlled, the badge at my waist caught the sun. "Marshal," I said, voice carrying steady, "credentials in my jacket." The shift was instant. Deputies surged past me, securing the downed men. Weapons confiscated, vests stripped, those cheap laminated badges tossed onto the hood of a cruiser. One officer bent low, pressing gauze to the bullet wound, calling for medics. I handed Morales my credentials. His eyes scanned, nodded, jaw tightening as the reality set in. "You've got it all on cam?" he asked. "Every frame," I said. My phone buzzed in my pocket, cloud backup confirming the upload, triple redundancy. By now half the street had gathered. Neighbors whispering, gawking, some recording on shaky phones. I caught Sandra's silhouette in the distance, at first-floor window. Curtains parted just enough for her face to show. Watching. Morales leaned closer. "This doesn't look like amateurs anymore. These guys came dressed for theater. Someone paid for this." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew where the trail led. The medics arrived next, rushing with stretchers. They loaded the wounded, sirens flashing again as the ambulance peeled away. Deputies read rights, cuffed the other two where they lay. Their heads hung low now, no swagger left. And me, I stood in my driveway, the gleaming untouched behind me. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel rage. What I felt was colder. A clarity that only comes when the mask slips and the enemy shows their face. Sandra wanted me gone. She wanted control. But she'd underestimated something bigger than the fines, bigger than her clipboard empire. I wasn't just a neighbor she could bully. I was a United States Marshal. And this was no longer HOA business. This was felony business. They loaded the last of the fake cops into the cruiser just as the sun dipped behind the row of roofs. The shadows stretched long across the pavement, catching the bloodstains that still glistened on the concrete. The neighborhood had fallen silent. No more gasps, no more whispers, just the hush of a crowd realizing they'd witnessed something they'd never forget. Deputy Morales stood beside me, tablet glowing in his hands. He watched the footage frame by frame, brows knit tight. Every second rolled by in crystal clarity, cheap badges flashing in the sun, crowbars raised, my badge revealed, the moment everything snapped. He didn't say much, didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than either of us could. "You handled it clean," he finally muttered, scratching at his jaw. "Force meets force, cameras don't lie." I nodded once, keeping my eyes on the SUV as it pulled away, tail lights flaring red against the darkening sky. "They were hired," I said, voice low. "You saw those vests. Someone wanted theater, wanted neighbors to believe this was authority." Morales locked eyes with me. "Sandra." I didn't answer, didn't need to. The deputies moved with quiet efficiency. Evidence bags filled with crowbars, laminated badges, fake uniforms, each tagged, time-stamped, sealed. The tow hook scraped once as they lifted it into the trunk of a cruiser. It sounded like the closing of a door I knew Sandra couldn't keep shut forever. Neighbors lingered at the edges, hesitant. Some whispered into their phones, others just stared. The older man who'd nodded at me in the HOA meeting finally stepped closer. He wore a faded ball cap, hands trembling as he shoved them deep into his pockets. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough with nerves. I looked at him and saw the weight in his eyes. Fear, shame, maybe even relief. "I'm fine," I said. "You should go inside, scene's still hot." He hesitated, then leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "We've all wanted someone to stand up to her. Nobody had the guts. You did." Before I could answer, he backed away, head down, disappearing into the cluster of neighbors retreating to their porches. When the cruisers rolled out and the crowd finally thinned, the quiet returned. A heavy, unnatural quiet, the kind that feels like it's waiting for something. I stood at the edge of the driveway looking at the untouched, gleaming, the prize Sandra had tried to take, and for the first time since moving here I didn't see it as just a car. I saw it for what it had become, a line in the sand. That night sleep didn't come easy. The hum of the fridge sounded louder than it should. Every creak of the settling house had me glancing at the cameras. At 3:07 a.m., I found myself standing by the window, staring at this glow. Sandra's house sat 3 doors down, curtains drawn, but I could feel her eyes just the same. By morning, the neighborhood had changed. Word travels faster than wildfire in places like. People who used to glance away now stared when I passed, some with respect, some with fear. Kids whispered as I drove by, their voices carrying the weight of what they'd seen. And Sandra, she showed up at the next HOA meeting like nothing had happened, pearls at her neck, clipboard in hand. Except her smile was now, her eyes sharper. She didn't bring up the incident, not directly, but her words had edges. "We must all remember," she said to the room, "to respect the authority of our community. Those who bring outside forces into our neighborhood only make it harder for everyone." I didn't speak, not yet. I just laid my phone on the table, screen dark but loaded with footage, waiting like a bullet in the chamber. Her words hung heavy in the stale air, but they no longer landed the way they used to. Too many had seen too much. That night Morales called. His voice carried a different kind of weight. "Paper trails opening," he said. "Bank transfers, small amounts at first, then bigger, same names tied to those 3 guys from yesterday. Guess whose signatures on a few invoices?" I didn't need to guess. "Handle the teach him to leave." That's what one of the messages read, clear as day, no code words, no ambiguity, just orders. Sandra's empire was cracking, but she didn't know it yet. She thought intimidation still worked. She thought fear still held the neighborhood in her palm, but fear has an expiration date. Once people see the mask slip, it never fits the same way again. Still, I knew better than to celebrate. Cornered animals bite hardest, and Sandra was cornered now. I kept the footage backed up in 3 places. Hard drives, cloud storage, a copy on a secure server she couldn't touch. Every angle, every second, every smirk frozen on tape. Proof she couldn't deny. The days crawled forward. Deputies came and went, quiet but efficient, questioning neighbors, collecting statements. The air grew heavier, like a storm waiting to break. And through it all, Sandra walked her dog in the evenings, head held high, smile plastered on, like nothing had happened, like she still ran this street. But the way people watched her told a different story. Conversations stopped when she passed, curtains twitched, whispers spread. For the first time since I'd moved here, Sandra wasn't the one being feared. She was the one being watched. And I knew it was only a matter of time before her kingdom of fines and threats collapsed in on itself. Sandra still walked the neighborhood like she owned it, same pearls at her neck, same clipboard tucked under her arm, same little dog tugging at the leash. From a distance, nothing had changed. But when you looked closer, when you watched the way people reacted, the cracks showed. Conversations died when she passed. Curtains shifted, then snapped shut. Neighbors who used to greet her with eager smiles now crossed the street or kept their eyes on the pavement. Her kingdom wasn't gone, but it was rotting from the inside. I felt it most at the next HOA meeting. The hall smelled faintly of burnt coffee and floor polish, the folding chairs squeaking as people settled in. Sandra sat at the head, chin lifted, smile sharp enough to cut glass. But her board, they weren't the same. One man fiddled with his pen, not looking up. Another woman kept her arms crossed, lips pressed tight as if bracing for something. Sandra cleared her throat, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "We need to discuss fines," she began, her voice firm but brittle. "Some residents continue to disregard our community standards. We cannot tolerate disorder." Her eyes flicked toward me, just for a second, enough for everyone to see where her aim was pointed. But this time, no one laughed at her jokes. No one nodded along. The silence stretched, and for the first time since I'd moved into, it was Sandra who looked uncomfortable. I didn't say a word, I didn't need to. I just laid my phone on the table, screen face down, a silent reminder of what it contained. The footage, the proof. The room shifted, small but noticeable. A few neighbors sat. One man, the same older gentleman with the cap, cleared his throat. "I think," he said slowly, "we should table fines until things are resolved." Sandra's smile froze. Her pen stopped tapping. She stared at him long enough to make the air feel heavy, then forced a laugh. "Resolved? What do you mean?" Nobody answered, but everyone knew. That night the neighborhood felt different. Porch lights stayed on longer. People lingered on their driveways, talking in hushed voices, glancing toward Sandra's house. The empire of silence she'd built was crumbling. Fear doesn't last forever, not when truth is staring people in the face. I watched from my window as her silhouette moved behind the curtains of her living room, packing back and forth. She was feeling the walls close in, even if she'd never admit it. A few days later, Morales knocked at my door. The morning was cool, the air sharp with the scent of freshly cut grass. He stood with a folder tucked under his arm, his cruiser idling at the curb. "You're gonna want to see this," he said, stepping inside. At the kitchen table, he spread the documents out. Bank transfers, text message screenshots, invoices with signatures. My eyes landed on one message, bold and damning, handle the "teach him to leave." I didn't need to see the signature at the bottom to know whose it was, but there it was anyway, Sandra. My jaw tightened, but I stayed silent, studying every line, every transfer, every breadcrumb that tied her to those three men now sitting in a county cell. "We'll move soon," Morales said quietly. "But we're building this airtight. When she goes down, it's gonna be hard and fast." I leaned back, exhaling slow. Good, she's been running this place on fear long enough. Over the next week, deputies came through more often. Subtle but noticeable, questioning neighbors, collecting statements. One by one, people started talking. Stories poured out, threats, bogus fines, vandalism swept under the rug. Sandra's grip had been strong, but the moment the dam cracked, everything rushed out. And I saw it in her eyes the next time our paths crossed. She was walking her dog again, clipboard under her arm. The sun was setting, painting the street in gold. She looked at me across the lawns, her smile strained, her steps too quick. She knew. She didn't have control anymore, she had only time. The whispers in the neighborhood grew bolder. Someone spray-painted "tyrant" on the sidewalk near her house. Mailboxes she once inspected daily now leaned crooked, ignored. The same people who used to bow to her rules now muttered openly, daring her to write another fine. And Sandra, she kept smiling, kept walking, but behind her eyes I saw it panic. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan turning slow above me. The quiet hum filled the room, but my mind wouldn't rest. I thought about all the people who had sat silent under her thumb, too afraid to push back. I thought about the way fear can live inside a community, passed like a sickness from one house to another. Sometimes the strongest power isn't violence, it's silence, and Sandra had wielded it like a weapon, but silence breaks, it always does. I turned onto my side, closed my eyes, and let the thought settle. Her end was coming, not because I wanted revenge, not because of me at all, but because when people see the truth with their own eyes, they can't unsee it. And every neighbor had seen the truth. The knock came at dawn. I was already awake, sipping black coffee in the kitchen when the sound echoed through the stillness. Firm, authoritative, the kind of knock that announces an ending. I set the mug down, the steam curling into the air, and stepped to the window. The sun was just beginning to lift above the roofs, throwing pale light across. Morales stood at Sandra's front door, flanked by two deputies. Their cruisers idled at the curb, red and blue lights cutting faint flashes across the quiet street. For once, there were no neighbors peeking from blinds, no dogs barking, just silence. A silence that felt like the entire community was holding its breath. Sandra answered the door in a silk robe, her hair wrapped in a towel. Even then, she tried to play the part. Chin high, eyes sharp. The little dog yapped at her ankles as she spoke words I couldn't hear. Morales didn't flinch. He handed her the warrant, voice steady, and then it happened, the moment the mask finally cracked. Her face twisted, disbelief flashing into rage. She shook her head, jabbing a finger at his chest, shouting words that carried down the street. "This is a mistake. You can't do this. I run this neighborhood." But her words didn't matter anymore. The deputies moved with quiet precision, reading her rights, securing her wrists in cuffs. The clink of metal was louder than her protests, louder than her screams. The little dog barked hysterically as she was led down the walkway, robe dragging against the concrete. Her eyes darted toward me once, burning with something between hatred and desperation. I didn't move, didn't blink, just stood at my window, coffee cooling in my hand, and watched the empire of fines and threats crumble into nothing. The deputies placed her in the back of the cruiser, her shouts muffled behind the glass. And just like that, was quiet again. But the quiet wasn't peace, not yet. The neighborhood buzzed. Word spread faster than wildfire. Cars slowed as they passed Sandra's house, drivers craning necks to stare at the empty driveway. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering, speculating. Some looked relieved. Others looked shaken, like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. The HOA board scrambled, holding an emergency meeting that afternoon. I didn't go, didn't need to. By nightfall, 3 members had resigned, citing stress and personal reasons. The empire Sandra had built wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. Still, her shadow lingered. People asked themselves what would happen next. Would she fight the charges? Would she find a way back? Fear doesn't vanish overnight. It leaves traces like the smell of smoke after a fire. I kept my guard up. Cameras running, notes documented, every file backed up in 3 places. I knew Sandra wasn't finished. Not yet. People like her don't surrender easily. They fight, claw, deny until the last possible second. And I was right. A week later, Marshal called me into the station. The trial date was set. The DA had everything: bank transfers, invoices, text messages, my footage, neighbor testimony. The case was airtight. But Sandra, she wasn't going quietly. Her lawyer filed motions, tried to throw out evidence, claimed harassment, claimed conspiracy, anything to claw back control. She's cornered, Marshal said, tapping a stack of files on his desk. But she's still dangerous, be ready for anything. I nodded. Danger didn't scare me. Not in alleys, not in courtrooms, not in neighborhoods with white fences and trimmed lawns. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, I thought about Sandra's scream. I run this neighborhood. It echoed in my head, not as a threat anymore, but as proof of something else. Proof of how tightly fear can grip people. Proof of how far some will go to protect an illusion of power. And it reminded me of a truth I'd learned long before. Control built on fear is never real control. It's borrowed time, and time always runs out. The trial was coming, the neighborhood was waiting, and Sandra, she was about to find out what happens when the mask comes off under oath. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and stale air. Rows of benches creaked under the weight of neighbors who had traded whispers in driveways for whispers in the gallery. Estates had spilled itself into the county courthouse, and for once, Sandra didn't sit at the head of the table. She sat at the defendant's desk, hands folded too tightly, pearls replaced with a plain blazer, her smile absent. The judge entered, gavel striking once, sharp enough to silence the low murmurs. The trial had begun. The district attorney wasted no time. Evidence was laid out like bricks building a wall around Sandra. Bank transfers projected onto the screen, small payments growing into larger ones, each funneling to the 3 men now awaiting their own sentencing. Text messages followed, their words cold, simple, damning. Handle the, teach him to leave. Sandra's attorney objected at every turn. Words like circumstantial and taken out of context filled the air, but the judge overruled again and again. And then came the footage. The lights dimmed slightly as the wide-angle video played across the monitor. My driveway filled the screen, timestamp ticking steady in the corner. The white SUV pulling in, the men stepping out, the cheap laminated badges flashing under the sun. Neighbors in the gallery leaned forward, breaths held. The sound carried, my voice cutting through the afternoon. On what authority? The fake cop's laugh, the swing of the crowbar, the chaos that followed. Every second burned into the jury's mind, every motion undeniable. Sandra shifted in her seat, her jaw tight, fingers drumming against the table. For the first time, she couldn't hide behind her smile or her clipboard. The evidence was louder than her. Then came the neighbors. One by one, they took the stand. The older man with the cap went first. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke. She made us afraid, he said, eyes lowered. Fines for things that weren't even violations, threats, subtle at first, then louder. We all knew better than to cross her. A mother followed, clutching her purse like a shield. My kids were afraid to ride their bikes past her house, she said, tears edging her words. She told me once that if I didn't repaint my fence, I might find my tires slashed. A week later, they were. The courtroom murmured, heavy with the truth spilling out. Neighbors who had been silent for months now spoke freely, their fear cracking open under the weight of the judge's gaze. And then it was my turn. I walked to the stand, the weight of the room pressing down, the eyes of my neighbors on my back. I raised my right hand, swore the oath, and sat. The DA began simple. "Tell us about the night your tires were slashed." I laid it out, step by step. The photos, the note, the doorbell cam, morale's warning. I spoke not with anger, but with precision. My training kept my voice steady, my words clear. "And the day of the attempted theft?" the DA asked. The footage had already shown the world what happened. I filled in the silence with what the camera couldn't capture. The weight of the crowbar, the sound of gravel under my boots, the smirk on their faces before it all unraveled. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Sandra's attorney tried to rattle me on cross, tried to suggest I escalated, that I could handled it differently. I let him talk, and then I leaned forward, locking eyes with the jury. "I didn't escalate," I said, voice low but carrying. "I stopped 3 men from stealing my car under the guise of law enforcement, and I didn't shoot to kill, I shot to stop. There's a difference, one they didn't expect, because they thought this was just another neighbor they could bully. They were wrong." The attorney faltered, stammered, then sat down. The DA saved the final blow for last. A letter, Sandra's handwriting, her signature at the bottom. An invoice tied directly to one of the payments. She couldn't deny it, not when the paper screamed her name. The jury didn't take long, hours, not days. When they filed back into the room, the air felt charged, like the pause before a storm breaks. The foreman stood, voice clear, verdict steady. Guilty of conspiracy, guilty of solicitation, guilty of HOA fraud. Sandra's face went pale. Her lips parted as if words would come, but nothing did. No smirk, no excuse, just silence. The judge's gavel struck. The sound echoed like a closing door. 30 months in state prison. Restitution ordered. Fines leveled. Sandra's empire was not only gone, it was dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but the memory of what fear had built. Neighbors exhaled in unison, as though they'd all been holding their breath since the day she'd first handed out a fine. The spell was broken. And me, I sat still, hands folded, letting the weight of it all settle. It wasn't victory I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter. Relief, maybe, closure. The kind that comes when justice finally arrives, not with fireworks, but with the steady voice of a jury saying enough. The trial ended with a gavel, but estates didn't change overnight. Change never does. It comes in ripples, small and slow, until one day you realize the tide has shifted for good. Sandra was gone, 30 months in state prison, her home placed under Leon, her clipboard kingdom dismantled piece by piece, but her shadow still lingered. For weeks, people still walked with a kind of hesitation, as if waiting for her to reappear from around a corner. Fear doesn't vanish in a verdict. It takes time to unlearn. The HOA board fractured. Resignations stacked like dominoes. One by one, members stepped down, citing stress, family obligations, or simply no comment. The county appointed a receiver to manage things until new elections could be held. Meetings that were once arenas of threats and fines now became awkward circles of neighbors, sitting with folded arms, trying to remember what community was supposed to mean. I attended a few, sitting quietly at the back. I wasn't there to lead, not to replace Sandra on the throne she'd built. I was there to watch, to make sure no one tried to rebuild her empire of intimidation. And slowly I saw the room change. Voices that had once been silent began to speak. The man in the cap, who had once whispered his agreement in secret, now raised his hand and challenged motions openly. The mother who had cried on the stand now spoke with calm strength about playground repairs and neighborhood watch. People laughed again, small at first, then louder. The kind of laughter that doesn't need permission. And me, I stayed. Stayed too, right there in the driveway, gleaming under the sun. No fines, no threats, just another car on another street. The symbol Sandra had tried to twist into a weapon was nothing more than what it had always been, mine. Some neighbors avoided me at first, not out of dislike, but out of awe, maybe even fear. They had seen me fight in my own driveway, had seen what training and steel resolve could do, but over time even that softened. One evening a boy from down the street pedaled up on his bike wide-eyed and asked if my car could go faster than in the movies. His honesty broke through something. I smiled, knelt down, and told him the truth. It can, but the real strength isn't in speed, it's in control. That night, sitting on the porch as cicadas hummed in the trees, I thought about everything that had happened. About Sandra's smirk, the bogus fines, the slashed tires, the fake cops in cheap laminated badges. I thought about the neighbors, their whispered fears, their silence. And I realized something. Evil doesn't always arrive with flashing lights or loud declarations. Sometimes it slips in quietly, wearing pearls, holding a clipboard and smiling as it hands you a piece of paper. Sometimes it convinces good people to stay silent, to look away, to whisper instead of shout. And sometimes it takes just one person to refuse. Not to win, not to destroy, just to refuse. Because refusal is contagious. One voice becomes two, two become 10. And soon the silence that once held everyone hostage begins to crumble. Sandra thought she owned estates. She thought fear was stronger than dignity. But fear fades, dignity endures. In the end, my driveway became more than a strip of concrete. It became a line that couldn't be crossed. And my badge, well, it wasn't the pistol or the training that ended her reign. It was the truth that badge represented. Order, justice. The reminder that no one, not even the queen of a neighborhood, stands above it. Weeks turned into months. Grass grew. Kids rode their bikes past Sandra's old house without glancing at the windows. Mailboxes leaned, sprinklers ticked, dogs barked at nothing. Began to feel like the place it was meant to be. Ordinary, quiet. And I stayed, not because I had to, but because leaving would meant she won. She wanted me gone, and I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Sometimes the strongest victory is not the battle itself, but the choice to remain. To hold your ground even after the dust settles. One evening, Marshal stopped by. He leaned against the porch railing, sipping coffee from a paper cup, eyes scanning the street. "You know," he said, "most people would moved after all that." I shrugged, watching the sun dip low behind the roofs. Most people don't carry the kind of memories I do. You learn not to run from storms, you wait them out. Sometimes you face them head-on. He nodded, quiet for a moment. "Guess needed someone like you." I didn't answer right away. I thought about the nodding neighbor, the crying mother, the boy on the bike. About the silence that had once ruled this place and the voices that now filled it. "Maybe," I said finally. "But the truth is, didn't need me. It needed itself. People just had to remember they had a voice." As night fell and porch lights flickered on, I felt the weight lift, slow and steady. Not gone, but lighter. The kind of weight you can carry. The sat in the driveway, catching the glow of the untouched, waiting. And me, I leaned back in the chair, listening to the sounds of an ordinary neighborhood, the kind I had once dreamed of when chaos was my daily bread. Had been broken, but broken things can be mended. And sometimes the strongest reminder of dignity isn't in the fight, it's in the quiet that follows. So I stayed. Because this was my home. And no one, not Sandra, not fake cops, not fear itself, was ever going to take it from me. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.